Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books, and today I am very excited to be bringing you my video for my favorite books that I read in 2022. Of course, now the year is winding down to a close. Now we're entering the end of December, and so now everybody on BookTube is talking about their favorite and least favorite books they read this year. Last week, I talked about my least favorite books, my 6 least favorite books, because I couldn't narrow it down to 5. So if you're interested in checking that out, then that is also on my channel. But today we're talking about the more exciting stuff, the stuff that I really liked this year. And there were a lot of books that I could have put on this list. So I do have some honorable mentions, but there were so many books that I read this year that I absolutely loved. And I have 10 here selected as my main top 10 list. But really, there were a whole lot of other books that I enjoyed. I read over 50 books this year, so of course there were plenty that I really enjoyed, but these ones were my particular favorites. And a couple of caveats before I start the video, very much the same as my least favorites list. Just because something is lower down on this list doesn't mean I didn't love it, because of course these are my favorites and I love all of them. And also, this is not a video ranking books that came out in 2022. There is a 2022 release on this list, but it is not books that came out in 2022, it's books that I just read in 2022. So the vast majority of these are older releases. There's only one new release on this list. Before I actually start the list, I do have several honorable mentions in 2 categories. One of them is rereads, so books that I reread this year that I really enjoyed, but I'm not counting rereads on this list. But otherwise they probably would appear if I was counting them, and other ones that I wanted to include on the list but just didn't make the cut. So as far as rereads, I would like to mention the whole Chronicles of Narnia series, which I reread this year for the first time in many years, and I absolutely loved it. My favorite book is probably Prince Caspian, but it's quite hard to say, honestly. I have a ranking of the Narnia series on my channel if you're interested in my thoughts on each of them. And my second honorable mention for rereads is the book Jedi Search from the Star Wars Jedi Academy trilogy. It is by far my favorite book of the trilogy. I thought it was so much fun to read. I, again, have a review of that trilogy on my channel, but I really enjoyed the first book a lot, but it was a reread, so I'm not including it on the list. And as far as some other honorable mentions that just didn't make the cut, I have 2 new release Star Wars books, including The High Republic Path of Deceit, which I really enjoyed. It's my favorite of the young adult High Republic novels thus far, and if I were extending this list to another spot to make it a top 11, it would probably be my 11th. But of course it just didn't make it. I also have Shadow of the Sith, which I really enjoyed as well. I also wanted to mention the very first 2 Witcher books. Not technically the first 2 because they're not the ones in the main series, but the ones that I believe were written first and are generally recommended to read first, the 2 short story collections, The Last Wish and Sword of Destiny, which I enjoyed quite a lot. Between the 2, my favorite is probably Sword of Destiny, just because I really enjoyed the character work in there, and that was more of a character-focused book for me, whereas The Last Wish was more of just a bunch of little short stories. But I really enjoyed both of those. And finally, my final honorable mention is going to be Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien, the 3rd entry in Lord of the Rings, and there's a couple of reasons I'm not including it. First of all, I started it at the end of 2021 and finished it in the end of 2022, so it's not technically a 2022 read, it's only kind of half of a 2022 read. I would still include it, though, if not for the fact that I also basically consider The Lord of the Rings all to be one entire story. I did read the first 2 books in Lord of the Rings last year, so if I had read, say, the 2nd and 3rd one this year, then I would consider that a 2022 reread, because I read the majority of it this year, but since I only read half of the 3rd book in 2022, I'm not including it, but I did absolutely love that as well. But anyways, now that I have gotten all that stuff out of the way, let's get into the actual list. So, my number 10, as I try not to knock over my big stack of books that I have in front of me, is The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, the first entry in the Wheel of Time, the only entry in the Wheel of Time that I have read at this moment, but I do have books 2 and 3, and I will probably read them towards the beginning of next year, sometime within the first month or 2, most likely. Of course, that depends on what else I end up wanting to read, but I am currently planning to read those at the beginning of next year. But I absolutely loved this book. I really enjoyed it a lot. I loved the world building. I thought that was probably my favorite aspect of this book, really, was the world building. Robert Jordan built such an interesting world with this book, and as from what I've heard, it just gets even bigger and more exciting as you go through this series. So I'm very much looking forward to reading the rest for that reason, and also because I've heard this is a fantastic series. I enjoyed the characters and the plot as well, not quite to the same extent, and ultimately that's the reason why it's my number 10 rather than being higher, because the world building really stuck out to me, whereas the characters and the plot, while I enjoyed them, were not as much. But I did really love this book, and I cannot wait to continue the series. Next up at number 9 is, again, a part of a series, and the only book in that series that I have read. However, it is a standalone within the series, and the series is Discworld by Terry Pratchett, and the book is Small Gods. This was just such a fun book to read. I just had such a wonderful time reading it. If this is any indication of what the other Discworld books are going to be like, I expect I am going to absolutely love them. It was just so funny and witty and just so much fun to read. A lot of the other books on this list and a lot of the ones that I read this year, I certainly enjoyed them, and in some cases I would consider them fun reads, but this one is like by far the most just straight up fun one to read, and I just had a great time with it. Love the characters as well. The characters were really great. I love Brutha, the main character, as well as the great god Om, who is this god who is in the form of a turtle, and their dynamic was just wonderful, and there were other great characters in there as well. And just generally, I really loved this book, and I am very excited to continue reading Discworld. I will probably start either the City Watch, I believe is the name of it, that series, or the Death series. I will probably go with one of those next. I'm not sure which. But I am very much looking forward to reading more Discworld. I really loved this book a lot. Next is two books that I do not have physical copies of, unfortunately, because I borrowed them. But that is the first two entries in the A Song of Ice and Fire series by George R.R. Martin, those being A Game of Thrones and A Clash of Kings. I really enjoyed both of these books a lot. They are so far my favorite entries in the series. Of which I've read 4, and I'm currently working on number 5. And for this series, for me, the main thing that really draws me in is the characters. I love the characters in this series. In the first two books, you get introduced to characters like Eddard Stark and Tyrion and Jon Snow, Daenerys, and Arya, and all of these other great characters, and I just had such a great time with those characters. I really enjoyed learning more about them and reading their chapters within the book, because they all have their own POV chapters, and I just generally really enjoyed that aspect of these books. I have also enjoyed the world building in these books. I think a lot of that kind of goes over my head a little bit because it's just a lot, but I did enjoy the world building in this as well, and it was just a really enjoyable read, and kind of left me a little heartbroken at a couple of points, especially the ending of the first book, which I'm not going to spoil, but it really kind of hit me hard, and if you know what happens, you know what I'm talking about. But I really enjoyed both of these books. I'm not sure which is my favorite between the two, so I'm not going to choose one, but I just really liked both of them. Next, at number 7, is the first book on this list that is not part of a series, although there, I believe, is a sequel planned for it, but it has not yet released. And that is the very first published novel by Brandon Sanderson, Elantris. Those of you who have been following my channel ever since I started it, I believe back in August, know that I have been really digging into Brandon Sanderson this year. So far, I have read 6 of his novels, and I have thoroughly enjoyed all of them. And this is my least favorite one, so you can probably guess some of the books you'll be seeing later on this list. But I really loved this book anyway. Again, I love the characters. I also really enjoyed the plot in this book. With Brandon Sanderson, a lot of the time, from what I have read, the thing that really draws me in is the characters and the world building. But this one, I actually really enjoyed the plot as well, particularly with the character Raoden. I really enjoyed his plot a lot. And even though this was probably my least favorite Brandon Sanderson book that I have read thus far, I did really enjoy it a lot. So yeah, that is my number 7. Next one up at number 6 is going to be a short story collection rather than a novel, so that's kind of a unique thing for this entry on the list. And that is going to be Cthulhu Mythos Tales by H.P. Lovecraft. This is the Word Cloud Classics version, if you're wondering about the specific one, because it, I think, has, not every single version of H.P. Lovecraft books has the same stories in it, so this is the particular one that I read. This was my first exposure to Lovecraft. I had watched some like YouTube videos and stuff, like some synopsis of some of his stories and things like that, but this was my first time actually reading Lovecraft. And I've read a handful of other short story collections of his. I have, for example, Stories of the Dreamlands and a couple of other ones. I have The Call of Cthulhu and other stories and stuff like that. But this one is my favorite one, both because it has a number of my favorites in it and also because I believe it has the largest number of short stories in it. This book in particular, you get about, I think, 24 short stories. So you get quite a few, and some of them are quite long. For example, At the Mountains of Madness, which is one of the longest stories Lovecraft ever wrote, I think is around 100 pages, or maybe even more than that, in this book. Most of the stories are not that long. Most of them are in the 30 or 40 pages or less range. But, you get some decently lengthy stories in here, along with a number of shorter ones, and a lot of ones in here that I really, really enjoyed. Some of my favorites include The Call of Cthulhu, At the Mountains of Madness, The Shadow over Innsmouth, the classic ones that everybody loves, as well as The Horror in the Museum, The Dreams in the Witch House, The Mound, Dagon, and several others. I enjoyed the vast majority of the stories in here. Of course, not all of them worked for me, but I liked most of them. And also, I include this on this list because if it were just down to the quality of the stories, it might be, a spot or two lower. But I had to put this a little bit higher because it was just a big influence on me and what I have become interested in because of Lovecraft's work. Having now read this book, I became interested in horror pretty much exclusively by reading this book. It was the first horror book that I had ever read. And I was already interested in it, but this kind of solidified that. And I just love the concepts and the ideas that he plays with in his stories. And so, in terms of the content of the stories, I think it's really good, but also just for what it personally means to me, did bump it up a little bit higher on the list. Now, breaking into the top 5. My number 5 is the only new release on this list, and it's also the only Star Wars book on this list, and that is The High Republic, The Fallen Star by Claudia Gray. I have really enjoyed The High Republic. I consider it my favorite thing to come out of Disney-era Star Wars, and is probably in my top 3 favorite Star Wars things that I've ever experienced. I just really enjoy this era and these characters and these stories a lot. And The Fallen Star is arguably my favorite book that has been released in this era so far. It is the final adult novel in Phase 1 out of 3 adult novels that were released, and I think it does a great job of capping off Phase 1, and it kind of leaves you on a cliffhanger because Phase 2 jumps back into the past for a while, and we're not going to see what comes after this one until Phase 3, unfortunately. But I really enjoyed this one a lot. I really loved the way that it kind of ended this arc of the High Republic. I also enjoyed, it has a little bit of some horror elements to it as well. I would say even going as far as to say it's kind of cosmic Lovecraftian horror a little bit when it comes to the certain enemies that are within this book. And considering that's kind of stuff that I got into this year, I really enjoyed that. But yeah, in general, I just really enjoyed The Fallen Star a lot. And it's a great book in the High Republic series. Next one up at number 4 is another horror book, this time a novel rather than short stories, and that is The Fisherman by John Langan. If you've seen my video where I talked about every book that I read this year, which if you're interested in checking that out, that's on my channel, I said that this would definitely be on my list, so no surprise here. But I absolutely loved this book. I just really enjoyed the story of it. It's basically two stories in one. There is a modern day story and a legend in the past that is told to the characters in the modern day. And the modern day, there's two sections that kind of bookend the book, one at the beginning, one at the end, and then the whole middle part. The majority of the book is the legend that takes place in the past. And I just found, as I was reading the legend, I found it super interesting, and I was also very interested in the modern day plot. Um, and the themes in this book I also really enjoyed. These top four books are some of the most emotionally gripping books that I have ever read. It just really resonated with me on a deeper emotional level, I think, than a lot of other books that I've read. So for that alone, I had to put this pretty high, but I also just really enjoyed reading it. I always wanted to know what was coming next, and it was just generally a really fantastic book, and I really loved it. Now, these next three I really struggled to order. I love all three of them, and if you've been watching my channel, you probably know what these three are going to be. And it is the rest of the work that I have read by Brandon Sanderson. As I mentioned earlier, Elantris is my least favorite of the books that I have read of his. So that's basically going to be the rest of this list. I can't choose a favorite out of these three. I think they are all wonderful. It's hard for me to really choose, but I just want to talk about all of them. The first one I'm going to talk about is the first one that I read, and it is the Mistborn trilogy, the original Mistborn trilogy. Even though I consider these all basically equal, if I were to order it, I might put this last, only because I think that the other books that I read in terms of individual books are better than all three of the original Mistborn books. But the Mistborn trilogy is a trilogy, so it kind of outdoes the other two because they are single books. But it's a hard thing to really say for sure whether I prefer one over the other, but out of these, if I were ranking them in terms of individual books, the Mistborn trilogy would be below my other two picks. But I absolutely loved the Mistborn trilogy. At first, I only got this first one, Mistborn, or as it's also called, The Final Empire. And I got this one because I had heard that you can, if you end up not liking it for whatever reason, read it as basically a standalone. It wraps things up pretty well, which is something I do appreciate about it. But as soon as I finished it, I was like, I need to get books 2 and 3. So I went out and got books 2 and 3, and I read them, and I loved them. If I were to pick a favorite in the trilogy, I would actually probably go with an unpopular pick and maybe say The Well of Ascension, the second book. Most people that I have talked to consider that the weakest of the trilogy, but I really enjoyed that one. However, I think the first book is maybe the most overall, like, tight, really, like, just solid from beginning to end. And the third book, while I think that in terms of overall, like, solidness is probably the weakest one, I think it took a little bit to really kind of get going. The climax of the third book and just all of the way everything comes together is just wonderful, and I loved it. So really, I could make a case for any of the three being the best ones, but when as far as when I first read them, I did consider the second one my favorite. Unpopular opinion, but it is what it is. But I absolutely loved all three books, and I would highly recommend reading them if you are looking into getting into Brandon Sanderson. Next one I'm going to talk about is actually the most recent one that I read, and like I said, I consider all three of these spots basically equal, but I think even more so for my number 2 and number 1 spot. I consider them basically equally my favorite. They both are basically fighting for my favorite Brandon Sanderson book. And even though the Mistborn trilogy, I think I may prefer over them in terms of a full story, because that is a full story. In terms of individual books, I consider these two better, but I also consider them basically equal, so it's very hard for me to choose between. But the next one I'm going to talk about is The Way of Kings, the first book of the Stormlight Archive, which is a series that I now am exceptionally excited to continue because I loved this book a lot. Now, this was just such a fantastic read. Again, I loved the characters in here, I loved the plot in here as well, I loved the world building. This is Roshar, which is the world that is in the Stormlight Archive, is at least from what I have read so far, easily the most vivid world that Brandon Sanderson has written, and I just absolutely loved reading about that world and learning more about it, and there's so much more left to uncover that I can't wait to find out. And I just love the characters. Kaladin, who is kind of the main character of this book, it's split between a handful of POVs, but he has the most because it's split into multiple sections and each one switches between the POVs. Um, but Kaladin has chapters in all of the sections, so he's basically the main character of this book. And I may consider him possibly my favorite of Brandon Sanderson's characters. He's definitely top three at least. Um, and I just loved his story, and I loved the story as well of Dalinar and Adolin, as well as Shallan and Yasna. I'm not going to get too super deep into this book because I have reviewed it on my channel very recently, so if you're interested in that, go check that out. But I just absolutely loved this book. It was such a joy to read, and I cannot wait to continue the series. And last but certainly not least, we have a standalone by Brandon Sanderson, and arguably my favorite book by him. It's very difficult to say between this one and The Way of Kings, and that is Warbreaker. Again, loved so much about this book. I loved the characters in this book, especially Lightsong. Lightsong, for me, even though I loved the other characters as well, he was the real standout for me. He was just so funny and so interesting, and I was super into his backstory, which not much is known about, but you slowly uncover different things about who Lightsong used to be before he died and then became a god. And I just love the concept of his character being a god who doesn't believe in his own divinity. It's such a fun concept, and I thought it was executed fantastically. And then you also have Ciri and Vivenna and the God King, who are all great characters. You've got Vasher, who was really interesting with his sentient sword, Nightblood, which was a fun dynamic. Um, the world building in this was also good. I would say between The Way of Kings and Warbreaker, I would probably say that The Way of Kings probably has the better characters and probably the better world building as well. I might have liked the plot better in Warbreaker. It's hard to say, but I really loved both of these a lot. But Warbreaker just, I don't know, something about it just really stands out to me, to the point where I would consider putting this above The Way of Kings. But it's just everything about it, and the themes and everything just really connected with me, and I just loved it a lot. But anyways, that is pretty much it for this video. That is my favorite books that I read in 2022. Let me know down in the comments what your favorite books that you read were in 2022, and if you have read any of the ones that I talked about on this list, and what you think of them. That is pretty much all I've got for you for this video. So thank you for watching, and I will see you guys next time.